Yeah, my name's Ian, and welcome to Between the Space. I'm with my good friend and colleague and recovery buddy,
I'm
Bob.
Bob. It's good to see you, Ian. I'm happy to be here with you. We'll dive in and see what is created in the space between this week.
Yeah,
I like what you
absolutely.
talked about earlier. It's
So,
unscripted. We
yeah,
do.
it's unscripted, it's unplugged, and we don't know where we're actually going, but we'll end up somewhere together. So I guess where I was, I've been looking at the Gurdjieff work, but through another. I won't go into that part. But I was sitting in the meeting the other day, thinking about on that 12 services after having a spiritual awakening, and I was
Yes.
reading that, and I thought, well, within the Gnostic work of Gurdjieff and Opinsky, whatever his name is, they talk about this awakening.
Yeah.
And if you're not doing the work, you're going back to sleep. So the whole process is to stay awake. And so that was my insight into recovery. I see my active addiction as being asleep, but that sleep turned into a nightmare. And then I had this awakening one day, and the part that resonates with me there is a friend of mine said was a rude awakening rather than a spiritual awakening. And but I woke up. And, then I was thinking about the process of sleeping, and I have been having nightmares lately, and really heavy dreams as I go through some deeper stuff within inside myself, and they all have significance. But then I was thinking about the nightmare and the waking up and trying to explain to my partner. She said, "Well, what was the nightmare about? What was the heavy dream about?" And I can't really recall it. I can give her snippets of what that was about, and that's a bit like my addiction. People say, "Well, what's your addiction like?" Or it's a nightmare. I can't remember the bits and pieces. I remember snippets, but I don't remember the whole theme. And so I don't think I'll ever recover the memory, but there is something there. And my fear is to go back to sleep. So if I'm not working my recovery like someone like you do, Bob, around, your swimming and your readings and your music and your writing and all the other bits and pieces that you do as a way of staying awake so you don't go back to sleep. I guess from my side, I'm relying on the martial arts and my private practice and, attending meetings and then reading Gnostic or existential, esoteric, and just reflecting and just getting deeper insights into who I am as a person. And that helps me stay awake. I think if I stopped all those processes, it wouldn't be long before I drifted back to sleep. Yeah. It wouldn't be long before I'd be back into that nightmare. Yeah. And I think that's the relapse. That was the insight from the meeting, because that's the relapse. Yeah.
I love the way that you're talking about awakening. It feels kind of, for some reason, it's odd that I would reference this owing to my own background, but in Christian faith, for example, somebody might experience a time of repentance or a turning, and then the rest of their lives are spent in the Christian term I've been familiar with is sanctification, that you work on embodying Christian virtues and so on. And it's, in other words, that salvation is not a one-time event, it's a lifetime transformative commitment. And I feel similarly. There's a way that you're talking about awakening. You've really opened it up for me. I really appreciate that. Is that what if we understand spiritual awakening or rude? Maybe the spiritual awakening starts with the rude awakening. I just love that. Is that we're rudely awakened, and then spiritual awakening is almost like it's a verb. It's a verb of action. There's an imperative quality to it. that means that it's with us for a lifetime. And I love the power of that image. Thank you so much for that. That you and I both know what it's like to risk going back to sleep. We know what it's like to have nightmares, and we're committed to staying awake. And I liked also something you said earlier, which is that it may be hard for people that haven't experienced the level of nightmare that you and I have, and so many people in addiction have had. There's other entry points, but addiction is the one that we're speaking of, is that it may be hard for people to understand how, I want to say driven, that sounds, but I mean from the inside, the driver behind staying awake is knowing what a nightmare can be like. And it's a defaulted life. It's the loss of birthright. And so I loved what you said earlier, is trying to describe addiction.
Background noise, Bob. Someone's out there whippersnipping on me. So I'm really interested. I'm kind of really going, I gotta pick this up. Yeah.
Sorry. Well, as difficult as it is to describe a dream, much less a nightmare, it's that difficult to describe what's it like to be in the grips of the nightmare of addiction. Really appreciate that. There's a poem I read years ago by Thomas Tranströmer. He's a Swedish poet. He won the Nobel Prize, actually, for literature. He wrote a poem, and it's been so long I can't remember the title of it, but he has this lengthy image, and as only a poet would write it, but he talked about the way it is that dreams, it's called Dream Seminar. That's the name of the poem, Dream Seminar. I used to use this poem in classes that I taught on dreams. He uses the image of pulling unprocessed film out of a camera before it's been treated, and how it is that it completely blanches the negative. All the photographic images are gone. Is it be like exposing film to the sunlight? He says that's what it's like when we try to bring dreams out into the light, like nightmares out into the light. The light just like it's very hard for the words.
I just had a thought then when you're talking about that. If people would like to understand what it's like to have an addiction, when I wake up out of the nightmare in my normal sleep, so I've gone to bed and I get up, oh wow, what's that about? I've got this embodied feeling of dread in my body, or embodied feeling of shame. That feeling, if people can relate to it, that's my experience of living with addiction 24/7.
That's good. That's really good. You remind me of something. 45 years ago, when I started graduate school, I worked for 3 years at a day treatment center, and I loved this job. It was every client, they all lived in board and care homes here in the US, and every client had the diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, every client. So we had a few dozen clients that would come every day, and I was very engaged in this program for the first 3 years of my graduate school. And I still remember a client, I still remember his name. I won't say his name.
Yeah.
I remember trying to describe to me one day, he said, Bob, I want to describe to you what it's like to experience psychosis, which he experienced. Thankfully, medication helped to moderate this. And this particular client was one of the highest functioning of our clients. You wouldn't know that he had psychosis as an illness because he was otherwise functioning at. Some of our clients had really impaired social skills. He didn't. He said it's like he said almost exactly what you just said, Ian. He said to me, he said, you know what it's like to have a nightmare? I said, yeah. He says, imagine waking up and the nightmare doesn't go away. In other words, you're in that nightmare 24/7. He says that's what it's like to be in his experience of psychosis, was that it's just you're in a nightmare and you have some awareness you're in a dream, but you don't have enough power to get outside of it. You can't control it, and it's 24/7. And I never forgot that image. That's 45 years ago. Now, what you've just shared about addiction feels absolutely apt to me. It's like, because all of us know what it's like to have a nightmare. Every human being knows what it's like to have a nightmare. And then imagine that that's on 24/7 for a period of time. In my life, it was for a period of 15 years, going deeper and deeper and deeper into the nightmare. And it was like every day was just trying to keep above the waterline and not doing a very good job of that.
Yeah, I muted it to try and cut out that background noise. And that's my experience of dreaming. I can go deeper and deeper into the dream as I'm dreaming in my dream world.
Yeah.
Or I can wake up out of the heavy dream or the nightmare and go, "Hey man, that's enough," and I'll go back to sleep and it starts up again.
Yeah. So you have an ability to work with it and move with it. And when you're in it, I loved what you said, because all of us know the feeling of waking up with the residue of the dream in our bodies. It's an embodied feeling, and it can stay with you all day long. I've had dreams that are just like, I just can't shake that feeling. If it's a feeling of dread or a feeling of terror or a feeling, whatever it is, it just stays with me. That's what this is like. I'm aware that one of the aspects of the nightmare for me of my own addiction was just incredible shame. I was just always felt awful about myself, felt ashamed of what I was doing, felt ashamed of the secrecy, ashamed of the fact I couldn't stop it. I mean, you could just go down the list. And so that was just like almost a constant bath of shame for me, the years of addiction.
And that's I just had a flash then about a client that I'm working with around there, and the fight we have when we're awake to stay out of those feelings. And the lengths that this client goes to around his dishonesty and storytelling and whatnot. It's that mask of that ego. I'm not really that person. I'm this person. See who I am. But in the background, I still got all these feelings going on underneath. If only you knew how I feel.
You know my story, Ian, and when I lost my license to practice psychology here in the U.S., it took me so long to acknowledge that addiction was at the heart of it. It's almost it's like the process of healing and reparation could have begun so much sooner had I not had so much shame. I remember working with attorneys that were counseling me through this process, including of applying for relicensure, and they were following my edict. They were covering over the elephant in the room, which was a pretty massive elephant. It was a herd of elephants, and it was my addiction. And so when I finally met with the board some years later, quite a few years later, I could be completely transparent, but it took years of recovery. And I know that it was an adversarial situation with the board and the attorney representing the board. They were coming after me, and they would say things that in the past I would have denied, even if they were true. I didn't deny anything. In fact, I think it shocked them because there was just no resistance.
That's right.
Everything that they were saying was awful. And if they wanted it to be more awful, I could share more details. There's nothing to be proud about that. But what a relief not to feel like that I have to hide anything. And I remember my attorney at the end of that particular grueling meeting with the Board of Psychology. He said this is what he does. He represents professionals who've lost their licenses, and some portion of them have gotten themselves into trouble with addiction. And he said, I've never had a client do what you did. He said, I wish I could have recorded that, because that's exactly what I would want every client to do, is just to go in there and to basically just be honest.
Yeah. And that brings you back to the sleep and awake. I'm awake now. I can have that conversation with you. And I haven't thought about this as I put this process together in my mind. I think there's something about operating from the lower self and operating from the shame and the guilt and the remorse and all those lower feelings. But if I wake up and I'm in my higher self, I'm in my spiritual self, you know, what we're talking about earlier before we turn the recording on, that, you know, it's not by chance. The hand of God's always there. I don't need to try and manipulate or drive the particular thing. This is who I am. Here I am.
Yeah.
I accept me, and I'm really sorry that you don't accept me.
If that's the case, yeah. This morning when I was swimming, as you know, you made reference to it, I continued the dialogue that's been going on fairly steadily for the last year or two with my early morning swims and my quiet time. And as I've shared with you before, Ian, it's a dialogue between two different parts of myself, and I just call them the soldier and the monk.
That's right.
Yeah, the soldier and the monk, and it's I still work on amends with people outside of my skin, but a lot of the work is interior and between me and God, as I understand God. And in this case, it's in response to what you just said about higher and lower selves. This morning, the dialogue, which this has happened any number of times, there's a soldier inside of me that got on board very early on that helped me to survive pretty atrocious circumstances.
Yeah.
It's just that he never evolved with the rest of me. He's still using things that a 6 or 8 year old boy does to survive, and I think he's pretty plucky. And I did survive enough so to be sitting here with you now, for which I'm grateful. That said, I've got a monk inside who doesn't really understand soldiers all that well. And so the dialogue in the morning between, I just do kind of active imagination. Yeah, I follow the forgiveness practice that you're well familiar with, is that the monk is able to forgive the soldier insofar as he's able to understand the soldier. And the soldier is able to forgive the monk because he's able to understand that the monk doesn't understand him. And so we move into a dialogue that whatever feels like a higher self to me is some dialogue between these two parts of myself, both of which are me. Much of my life, I privileged the monk and ignored the soldier as the soldier went further and further underground. I don't want that to happen again. I'd like to stay awake. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And the soldier has paid heavy dues. The soldier deserves his credit or her credit, you know. And so that dialogue's been very active for a couple of years. It took me a while to identify the characters. I wanted somebody who does this for a living. Soldiers do it for a living rather than a warrior. I wanted a soldier. And I thought about a saint, but I thought, no, saints don't do it for a living. A monk does that for a living.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about the job of the soldier is to protect and keep people alive. Yeah.
It is. And he's damn good at it. It's just that the things that he does are pretty unrefined. He's because he started off really young. He was required for me very early on. So he found a couple of big clubs around there, and he's really good with those clubs. And the monk comes along and says, the monk is like Jesus says to be as wise as a serpent and innocent as a dove. Well, the monk has some wisdom to impart, and he doesn't mean harm. The soldier in me, when he gets going, he means harm.
Yeah.
Grievous harm. And so,
he knows hand-to-hand combat.
Yeah, exactly. He operates with extreme prejudice.
Yeah. Knows how to wrestle in the mud.
Exactly. And I've come to love him, and what I mean by that, the monk has come to love him. And the joy for me at the end of my prayer each morning is the coming together of these two parts that might be seen as I can't say for other people. For me, I've had them opposed. I spent the first 30 years of my life very identified with the monk. I think the next 30 years are pretty close to it. This includes my addiction, pretty identified with the soldier, and it won't do to cast out either one. It's like, how can we bring them together? And I can feel it when I'm swimming. I can feel it right now sharing with you the joy that comes of their walking arm in arm.
Yeah. Yeah, I have this image of the monk driving the bus, so to speak, and then the soldier sitting in the background, and then someone steps on his toes and he's up. He's up. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think everybody has their own way of finding their way with this. I think I had a split in my life, and I have to own up to it. You and I talked about this idea of spiritual bypassing. I spent a lot of time bypassing the trauma of my life and the foundations that later bloomed into full-on addiction. So very early on, I had bad habits that were a way to self-regulate, to help manage my anxiety and my depression. And I found a way for about 30 years of my life, the first third of my life, I found a way to just bypass all that. And I did it in a way that I don't feel like I've done forgiveness work with God and with Jesus, because I asked for their forgiveness for the way that I misconstrued what they have to offer me. And I bypassed my human responsibility. Having said that, I went to the opposite extreme. My partner and I just talked about that this weekend, that I grieve the fact that I spent years in rebellion against what I had done, in rebellion against the spiritual bypassing. And now I was involved in another kind of bypassing. I was bypassing spirituality. And I'm hoping that the remainder of the years that I'm given can be more integrated of the best of both of those, and maybe less of the worst of each.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a really rich conversation this morning.
Thank you. You started it off, and I really appreciate it. It's very illuminating for me. I'll carry your image of awakening as an ongoing process, as a verb. I'll carry that with me forward. I really appreciate that from Gurdjieff and Uspensky and from you, Ian. And I also love there's a way that you bring in talking about dreams and nightmares. You shared earlier, I don't think it was in the recording, the experience of a child that wakes up after a nightmare and doesn't want to go back to sleep. There's a way that you flow so organically in terms of just life as it is. I really appreciate this about you, Ian. There's a groundedness. I feel tears rising up. There's a groundedness, and I do think of Christ having been this way. I think Christ just told stories. I just think he was. I love the Irish singer Van Morrison, and he has an earlier album that's been very meaningful to me called Common One, and the whole album is about Christ, and he just refers to Christ as the common one. Lao Tzu says, "I'm not like ordinary people. I'm more ordinary." That's how I see. That's how I see Jesus. I feel like Jesus was in that sense extraordinary, because he was not above the most ordinary of circumstances. And I'm trying to get better at that.
Yeah, it's a practice, I think. Well,
It is a practice.
Because part of my process, part of my recovery process, is to take concepts like awake and sleep and just sit with it. Like I've been sitting with that since we met last, I think. Just after I read something, and I thought, and I just allow it to percolate, and their insights. Then the insight comes, and the narrative gets put together. And I'm kind of blessed where I can sit in a place like an AA meeting, and people don't care what you say, and I'll put the thing together, and then I walk out of the meeting going, yeah, that's right, and then add the next little bit. Yeah.
That's beautiful. I love what you're doing. I do that in the morning. And for the last week or two, I've been working on a single passage from T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets. First of all, I commit it to memory. It's a lengthy passage. And then I just let it seep in word for word, thought for thought. And it ends up, it doesn't matter. You could pick the Bible, you could pick poetry, you could pick an AA meeting. It doesn't matter. It's just whatever the form is, and just keep letting it. I don't know if you have this in Australia. When I grew up as a little boy, one of my favorite desserts my mom would make was a pineapple upside down cake.
Yes.
I don't know if you.
Yeah.
And all I remember, I watched her cook it. She would poke holes with the toothpick on the cake, and then turn it upside down, and the pineapple would seep down into it. That's the way that I think about what we're talking about. You get a good idea, and you get a good couple of sweet pieces of pineapple, and let them just soak down into the cake. It makes for a yummy meal.
Yeah. But for me, that us moving forward with the recordings and that, I think it's a good foundation what we've done this morning around, waking up, and it really, for me, it really embraces that spiritual concept of what recovery is, and what are the practices we can do to stay awake.
Yeah, I really like it. It does feel foundational to me. You can think of all the clients you've worked with, and me too, in addition to our own recovery and the colleagues we've known in recovery. But I see this because my work is full-time working in recovery with clients. So oftentimes early conversations around helping to put in perspective that we're trying to stop drinking, let's say, but to sustain that, it's going to require a real commitment to staying awake. And for most people I work with, that's not a given. That's not assumed. That the idea is I just stop, and then somehow I just kind of, my sheer dint of will stop. And we know what Bill Wilson had to say about that. And so it requires, if we talk about a spiritual awakening in the spirit of Bill Wilson, the idea that that's a lifelong commitment to staying awake, the way that you've talked about it, I think is really rich. And anybody can relate to that. It's not complicated. It's like, okay, I just need to stay awake. And anybody who's been in serious addiction certainly will understand the metaphor of nightmare.
Yeah. And the other part of that really quickly, because I know you got to scoot, is that the therapy or the coaching that we do professionally is that the clients come in and they're basically saying, I'm scared. I think I'm going back to sleep.
Yeah.
And then it's having a mum or a dad there saying, well, stay awake.
Yeah.
What is going on in your life that you use psychological terms, what's going on in your life that you're avoiding? What is going on in your life that you need to go back to sleep?
I just saw a client this last Thursday, I'll say this briefly, had a very major relapse just recently. And I've worked with him for a few years. He's been sober, and he had a major relapse. And we sat down, and we were this way. He's in another part of the country, and I went right for let's piece together what's happened here. And he stopped and he said something to me that he's never said. He calls me Dr. Weathers. He said, Dr. Weathers, I really appreciate your empathy, is what he said.
Yeah.
He said, because he was so judging himself for having screwed up royally. And in one way of looking at it, he has. But I'm interested in getting at what led to that, because I don't assume, like we were saying earlier, Ian, I don't assume anything's accidental, least of all a relapse. And as soon as we took that tack, it began to supply some fruitful things that we need to address that haven't been addressed, which led up to the dam cracking. Is what happened, and now we're piecing it together. But I want to provide him assurance. I said, I feel really confident if you'll stay with this process that we can get you back in the saddle. I use the image of getting back in the saddle and staying in the saddle. That's really the goal. He's proven he can do that, but something snuck up on him, and it wasn't a part of our conversations, and it got the best of him. So we need to go back and
and the practices that get put together, or the practice that get put together is about designed to stay awake.
Yes, that's exactly right. I'm going to start quoting you on that. Of course, I'll say I'll say this is, I'll have to give you the copyright or the trademark, or the royalties go to Ian for that anytime I say that. But it's a really, I really like that as a translation. It's not the way I've talked about it. It's another entry point that I really like. Okay, my friend, I've got to scoot.
Thank you, Bob.
This is great. Love to you, Ian. It's great seeing you. Have a wonderful day and a good week. Okay, I'll see you in a couple. Bye bye.
Bye now. Yeah.